In the late autumn of 1847, a heavy wooden merchant ship slid out from the harbor of Cork, Ireland. Its hold was packed to the hatches with sacks of prime Irish wheat and fat livestock. Guarding the gangways were royal soldiers with primed muskets and fixed bayonets. On the cobblestone quay below, hundreds of starving men, women, and children stood in rags. Their faces were hollowed by famine, watching the food leave their shores under armed escort. Less than 10 miles inland, in towns like Skibbereen, entire families lay dying in unheated mud cabins. Their bodies were decaying before they even stopped breathing. This was not a remote, forgotten corner of the medieval world. This was Ireland in the 19th century, an integral part of the United Kingdom, governed directly from Westminster. It was the undisputed heart of the wealthiest, most powerful industrial empire on earth. Yet over the course of 7 horrifying years, a simple microscopic fungus would destroy the potato crop and trigger a catastrophe that claimed 1 million lives and forced another million to flee across the ocean. How could the richest nation on the planet allow 1 million of its own citizens to starve to death while exporting food from their ports? This is the true history of the Great Famine. To understand how a single plant disease could collapse a nation, you have to look at the strange, fragile world of pre-famine Ireland. By 1845, Ireland was one of the most densely populated places in Europe, home to roughly 8.5 million people. Its economic reality was a ticking time bomb. Most of the fertile land was owned by a small class of Anglo-Irish Protestant landlords. Many of these landlords lived full-time in London, rarely setting foot on their estates. Beneath these absentee landlords was a complex pyramid of middlemen and tenant farmers. At the very bottom sat the cottiers and landless laborers, comprising nearly half the population. They owned no land, possessed no money, and earned no wages. Instead, they worked the landlord's fields in exchange for a tiny plot of rocky soil, usually no larger than an acre or two. On such small plots, traditional crops like wheat or oats could never yield enough food to keep a family alive. But there was one miracle crop that defied all rules of agriculture: the potato, specifically a high-yielding, resilient variety known as the Irish lumper. Lumper grew in terrible soil, required almost no tools other than a spade, and contained an extraordinary balance of nutrients. Adult male laborer could survive entirely on a diet of 12 to 14 pounds of potatoes a day, supplemented only by water or buttermilk. For over 3 million people, the potato was not a side dish. It was breakfast, lunch, and dinner every single day of their lives. It was an economic ecosystem built entirely on a single leg. If that leg snapped, there was no backup plan, no savings, and no alternative food source. The summer of 1845, the weather across Ireland turned unusually cold and wet. Fog hung thick over the green hills of West Cork and Mayo. Unbeknownst to Irish farmers, a microscopic organism named Phytophthora infestans had crossed the Atlantic aboard steamships from North America. It carried airborne spores that traveled on the damp wind, settling on the lush green leaves of the potato fields. In September 1845, farmers went to sleep, looking at fields of healthy green plants. Woke up the next morning to find their crops turned into black, slimy mush. The decay smelled foul, like rotting flesh, and they dug into the soil. The tubers were already black and liquefying into a fine-smelling goo. The blight had arrived. In London, Prime Minister Sir Robert Peel recognized the immediate danger. Peel was a practical, pragmatic, conservative administrator. Knowing that open intervention would anger the grain merchants and his party, Peel acted in secret. He quietly authorized the purchase of 100,000 pounds worth of Indian corn from North America, establishing relief depots across Ireland to sell the grain at cost and stabilize prices. Peel's swift action prevented mass starvation in the winter of 1845. It was only a temporary bandage over a gaping wound. To fund his emergency measures, Prime Minister Peel made a decision that would shatter his own government. He moved to repeal the Corn Laws, a set of high protective tariffs that kept foreign grain expensive to protect British landowners. Peel argued that in the face of a famine, artificial food tariffs were morally indefensible. Repeal passed in June 1846, but it split the Conservative Party down the middle. Angered by what they saw as a betrayal of agricultural interests, Peel's political opponents joined forces with the Whig opposition to bring down his government. Peel resigned, leaving the crisis in the hands of a newly formed Whig administration led by Lord John Russell. Power over Irish relief shifted into the hands of the Treasury's permanent secretary, Sir Charles Trevelyan. Trevelyan was a brilliant, hard-working administrator, but he was completely captivated by two dominant ideas of Victorian elite culture: strict laissez-faire free market economics and providentialism, the belief that human events were guided directly by the hand of God. Trevelyan believed that government intervention in the food market was a dangerous sin. In his view, if the state provided free or cheap food, it would destroy private grain traders, encourage Irish laziness, and undermine local self-reliance. He argued that the market must be left completely alone to adjust prices naturally, regardless of how many people went hungry in the short term. More chillingly, Trevelyan viewed the blight not as a tragic biological accident, but as a divine intervention. In his private correspondence and later writings, he described the famine as a punishment from God to discipline the Irish people, cure their overpopulation, and force them to abandon their backward agricultural system. He wrote that the judgment of God was sent to teach the Irish a lesson, and that the calamity must not be soft-pedaled by state charity. In the summer of 1846, the blight returned with apocalyptic force. Unlike the partial loss of 1845, the 1846 crop was almost completely wiped out. Nearly three-quarters of the entire national harvest rotted in the ground within a matter of weeks. The entire food supply of 3 million people simply vanished. Faced with total disaster, Trevelyan did not double down on Peel's emergency food purchases. Instead, he ordered the government grain depots to close. He declared that private merchants must be given a clear field to import and sell grain without state competition. Private traders had no interest in shipping grain to impoverished rural villages where nobody had a single penny to buy it. Food arrived in Irish ports, but it sat in warehouses protected by armed guards because the starving population could not afford market prices. Give the poor a way to earn money without receiving direct handouts. The Whig government launched a massive system of public works. Starving men were required to break stones and build roads in exchange for a few pence a day. By the winter of 1846, over 500,000 Irishmen were breaking rocks in freezing rain and snow. Many collapsed and died on the roadside, spade in hand, earning wages that could no longer keep pace with skyrocketing food prices. The year 1847 entered Irish history as Black 47, the darkest year of the catastrophe. The winter was one of the coldest in recorded European history. Blizzard after blizzard swept across Ireland, striking a population already weakened by 18 months of starvation. The public works system collapsed under its own bureaucratic weight, leaving hundreds of thousands without income. Starvation was no longer the only killer. Epidemic disease stalked the countryside. Typhus, known as famine fever, and relapsing fever swept through overcrowded hovels and workhouses. Dysentery, caused by eating raw turnips, rotten vegetation, and uncleaned grain, turned entire villages into open graveyards. Reports from West Cork horrified readers across Great Britain. Local magistrate Nicholas Cummins visited the parish of Skibbereen and wrote an open letter to the Duke of Wellington. Described entering a small mud cabin to find 6 famished figures huddled in a corner, their skin blackened by fever, lying alongside the decaying corpse of an infant that had died days earlier. Skibbereen became an international symbol of an empire standing by while its people perished. Realizing that the public works scheme was a total disaster, Parliament passed the Temporary Relief Act in early 1847. The government abandoned stone-breaking and set up soup kitchens across the country. By midsummer, over 3 million people were receiving daily rations of thin liquid soup or cornmeal porridge. For a brief moment, the death rate stopped climbing. Soup kitchens proved that direct food relief worked. But just as the system began saving lives, London decided it was time to shut it down. Government officials argued that British taxpayers could no longer subsidize Irish poverty. The summer of 1847, the Poor Law Extension Act was passed. It declared that all future relief must be funded entirely by Irish property owners through local property taxes known as poor rates. Irish property must support Irish poverty. It was a formula for total financial collapse. Attached to this law was one of the most destructive pieces of legislation in British history, the Gregory Clause, introduced by Member of Parliament William Gregory. The clause stated that any tenant who occupied more than 1/4 of an acre of land was legally prohibited from receiving public relief or entering a workhouse. The Gregory Clause presented starving cottiers with an impossible choice. If they kept their tiny family farms, their wives and children would be turned away from the soup kitchens to starve. If they wanted a bowl of meal to survive the week, they had to surrender their land leases to their landlords. Landlords facing astronomical local tax bills for every poor tenant on their estates realized that clearing the land of poor people was their only financial salvation. Armed with eviction orders, landlords accompanied by county sheriffs and police squads marched from village to village, forcibly removed families, dragged out their meager belongings, and used crowbars to pull down the roof beams and stone walls, ensuring the tenants could never return. At the Strokestown estate in County Roscommon, Major Dennis Mahon inherited an estate heavily in debt and overcrowded with thousands of impoverished tenants. Mahon decided to clear his land systematically. In 1847, he evicted over 3,000 people, offering them a choice: take passage on a chartered emigration ship paid for by the estate, or be thrown onto the road with nothing. For those cleared from the land, the only option left was flight. In 1847, a mass exodus began. Over 100,000 people boarded timber ships bound for North America in a desperate bid to escape the grave. These ships, quickly dubbed coffin ships, were never designed to carry human cargo, were unventilated, filthy, and lacking adequate water, food, or medical supplies. Ship fever typhus ran rampant in the dark, cramped holds. Passengers lay trapped in soiled berths for 6 to 8 weeks, as Atlantic storms battered the wooden hulls. On ships like the Elizabeth and Sarah, hundreds set sail, but dozens died before reaching sight of land. The dead were wrapped in canvas and thrown into the ocean without ceremony. For those heading to Canada, the voyage ended at Grosse Ile, an island quarantine station in the St. Lawrence River near Quebec. In the summer of 1847, dozens of coffin ships sat anchored off Grosse Ile, lined up for miles waiting for medical inspection. Thousands of passengers lay dying in their berths. Over 5,000 Irish emigrants were buried on that small island in 1847 alone, their graves marked by mass trenches. Back in Ireland, news of the horrific mortality aboard Mahon's chartered emigrant ships reached Roscommon. Outrage turned to blood vengeance. November 2nd, 1847, as Major Dennis Mahon was driving his carriage home in the dusk, 2 men stepped out from behind a hedge with loaded shotguns. A volley shattered the night air, and Mahon fell dead on the road. The assassination of Major Mahon sent shockwaves through London. British press painted the Irish as ungrateful, bloodthirsty savages who murdered their benefactors. Rather than re-examining the cruelty of mass evictions, Parliament responded by passing the Crime and Outrage Act, sending extra troops to disarm the Irish peasantry and enforce law and order. Yet, amidst the coldness of government policy, acts of profound human solidarity emerged from the most unexpected places. In 1847, members of the Choctaw Nation in North America gathered in Oklahoma. Just 16 years earlier, the Choctaws had been forcibly driven from their ancestral homelands by the United States government on the brutal Trail of Tears, losing thousands of their own people to hunger and disease. Hearing of the suffering in Ireland, the Choctaw people scraped together $170, an extraordinary sum, for a displaced tribal community, and sent it across the ocean to feed starving Irish families. It was a gesture of shared human empathy that bridged continents, creating a bond between the Choctaw Nation and the Irish people that endures to this day. Similarly, the Society of Friends, or Quakers, organized massive private relief efforts. Refusing to discriminate based on religion or political views, Quaker volunteers established soup kitchens, distributed clothing, and imported hand mills to grind corn. While official government channels stalled in red tape, Quaker volunteers saved tens of thousands of lives through sheer moral courage and logistical efficiency. The famine did not end in 1847. Blight returned again in 1848, 1849, and 1850. With the Irish economy completely broken, local poor law unions went bankrupt one after another. In response, London passed the Rate in Aid Act, forcing the solvent unions in the north and east of Ireland to bail out the ruined unions in the west. It was a policy of forced self-containment. Ireland was left to consume itself. The estate owners who thought evictions would save them were caught in their own trap. Unable to collect rent from empty lands, hundreds of landlords defaulted on their mortgages. Parliament passed the Encumbered Estates Act in 1849, forcing bankrupt Irish estates into public auctions. Millions of acres were bought up by speculative investors who consolidated small holdings into large cattle ranches, sealing the end of the traditional Irish cottier way of life. By the time the blight finally faded in 1852, Ireland had undergone a demographic collapse unprecedented in modern European history. In 1841, the population stood at 8.5 million. By 1851, it had plunged to 6.5 million. Roughly 1 million people had died of hunger and disease. More than 1 million had fled aboard emigrant ships. Devastation was concentrated in the western Irish-speaking districts. The Gaelic language, which had flourished for thousands of years, suffered a blow from which it would never fully recover, as its native speakers died or emigrated. The traditional social structure of early marriage, large families, and subdivided land was replaced by late marriage, celibacy, and permanent emigration. Ireland became a country that exported its youth. In the generations following the Great Hunger, debate over its causes became deeply radicalized. Irish nationalist leaders such as John Mitchell famously declared that the Almighty indeed sent the potato blight, but the English created the famine. Mitchell claimed that the catastrophe was an intentional act of genocide, designed by London to wipe out the Irish race. Modern historical research presents a more complex and troubling picture. Extensive analysis of shipping records by economic historians shows that while grain was indeed exported during the famine, imported corn exceeded exports by 1847. The primary tragedy was not a secret plot to starve a population, but the fanatical adherence to a dogmatic economic theory. Laissez-faire combined with deep-seated anti-Irish prejudice and administrative incompetence. Popular myths also obscured personal actions. Persistent legend claimed that Queen Victoria contributed only £5 to famine relief. In reality, official royal archives confirm she made a personal donation of £2,000, making her the largest individual donor to Irish relief. The bitterness of the disaster was so profound that myths naturally grew to match the scale of the grief. Great Hunger did not remain an Irish story. Millions who fled aboard coffin ships landed in Boston, New York, Montreal, and Melbourne. They brought with them a deep, burning resentment against the British Empire, transforming American politics and laying the financial and political groundwork for the Irish War of Independence. 7 decades later, Great Hunger stands as a timeless warning of what happens when market dogmatism and institutional indifference override basic human empathy. Why do you think ideology so easily blinds governments to obvious human suffering? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to like and subscribe for more deep dives into the turning points of human history.